Welcome to Advocacy and Politics Unplugged, the show that will dissect critical policy issues, explore the art of advocacy and politics, and share insights on how to make your voice heard in today's ever-changing political landscape. I'm your host, John Ravitz, the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the Business Council of Westchester. We're so glad that Con Edison has been our sponsor for our podcast, and we look forward to the continuing good relationship that we have with Con Edison. Our guest today is Mike Elmendorf, who is the President and CEO of the Associated General Contractors of New York State, which is the leading contracting industry association, and he's been in that role since February of 2011. Mike's also served as the president of Rebuild New York Now, a broad-based coalition of business, labor, local and government and environmental organizations advocating for increased investment in transportation and environmental infrastructure. In the 2016-17 budget cycle, Rebuild New York Now ran a successful campaign to restore parity between the New York State Department of Transportation and the MTA's capital plan that resulted in a record investment in both systems. In that budget cycle, Rebuild New York Now led a campaign that helped secure $2.5 billion for environmental infrastructure across the state. Previously, Mike has served as the New York State Director of the National Federation of Independent Businesses, NFIB, which is New York's largest small business advocacy association, which he led a resurgence of NFIB New York, establishing it as one of the Empire State's most powerful and effective business organizations. Prior to joining NFIB, Mike spent 11 years in the administration of New York Governor George E. Pataki. He served in extensive roles as the special assistant to the governor and the director of intergovernmental affairs. And in that role, he was a member of the governor's senior staff and served as the governor's advisor on state, federal, regional, state-to-state, and international relationships. Mike, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, John. Great to be with you. I hope we're not out of time after all that.
No, we'll make time. And, again,
I need a shorter biography. Even I get bored listening to it, so I can only imagine how your listeners feel. But it's great to be with you, my old friend.
It's easy to read a bio that has substance. And one of the things that excites me about having you on the show is we really try to bring to our listeners people who are really on the front lines, who are advocating on behalf of their sector, but more importantly, are building relationships across the board, which make it so important. So let's just take a little bit of time and just talk about the role that the Associated General Contractors of New York State of New York have within your industry.
Sure, yeah. So, John, as you mentioned, we are the leading statewide organization representing the construction industry. Basically, everything other than single-family homes in New York are built by our members. So roads, bridges, commercial buildings, hospitals, schools, power plants, utility infrastructure, you name it. And we represent pretty much nearly all the leading contractors across New York working in those sectors. Obviously, you think about the impact of the things that our members build. They define our communities. They make our economy possible. They help us get from A to B. It's a great group of entrepreneurs, risk takers. They take enormous risk every day to do what they do. They work under tough conditions routinely with often surprises once they get started on a project. And they and their teams find a way to make it work. So it's really a great role. As you mentioned, I've been here for 14 years. Have enjoyed every day of it. We have an incredible team here, beyond advocacy, obviously, which, you and I work together, and AGC and the Business Council of Westchester work together often on a lot of issues. You're great partners and a great resource for your members and for our members. We have a lot of members in common. We do a lot of other things too. We provide safety services. We have 2 safety professionals out in the field that work across the whole state of New York to either provide site safety services or supplement the site safety services of our member firms or help them when they have a particular issue. One of the things that makes AGC unique is we also have subject matter experts. So in addition to our 2 safety professionals, our vice president on the vertical building side of the house, Joe Hogan, has been with the association for 37 years, if you can imagine that. And I'm not sure there's anyone in the state that's got more experience and expertise on construction and contract issues than Joe. And on the transportation side of the house, Tom Weiser, who's our VP there, is a PE. He's a 30-year veteran of DOT, was the head of construction at New York State DOT. And these 2, along with the rest of our staff, really sort of integrate with our members and become, in a way, an extension of their own team and help them, on very detailed, complex, issues. So it's a great organization. It's a great industry. The work our industry does touches every other industry in the state. And as I always say, we have no shortage of problems in the state of New York. Lots of ideas affecting our industry, lots of them not helpful, as you well know.
And we'll get into some of those. But again, I think what's so important is, as both of our organizations look to, in a sense, recruit and retain businesses into New York State, we have to be able to prove that we have a reliable infrastructure. And that's both on the transportation side and the building side. You've talked about the huge scope of work that your organization does, but that also comes with challenges. Legislative challenges that we have to deal with almost on a daily basis. But talk to us a little bit about the challenges that you and your members are facing, and again, what the impact is to that.
Well, how much time do we have?
I'll let you know.
Yeah. There's a lot of challenges. And you mentioned, John, the importance that this condition and how modern your infrastructure is plays not just in retaining jobs, but in recruiting jobs and employers. It's, infrastructure is one of the top things that site selectors look at. And in too many categories, New York fails when it comes to infrastructure. I mean, just think about transportation infrastructure, right? Despite the fact that we got a huge increase from the federal government in the bipartisan infrastructure bill a few years back, it was a better than 50% increase in just formula funds that New York gets from the federal government for road and bridge maintenance and repair. In that same period of time, we've seen every single region of the state's bridges get worse, which is without precedent. 2/3 of the regions have seen their pavement conditions get worse. A statistic you well know, John, because you work very closely with us and are a great advocate with your organization on this. Unfortunately, your region has the worst pavement and bridge conditions in the state. It's because of a variety of things. Yeah, decades of underinvestment, but also the unfortunate timing of that big increase in funding aligning with unprecedented inflation and material cost escalation that better than ate away, in many cases, the increase that we got. And so we're dealing with declining conditions, which makes repairing them more expensive for the state. It imposes billions of dollars a year in cost on New York drivers, right, as they hit those potholes. And I'm sure many of your listeners have done that just recently, because we are in the high tide of pothole season in New York. The whole state's turning into a pothole at this point. So funding is obviously a big one. And, we work closely with you and your team on that, John. The good news is this year we got everybody's attention. The governor included an $800 million increase for New York State DOT core capital needs in her executive budget. The Senate and the Assembly concurred with that increase. That's great. We'll all breathe a sigh of relief for a lot of reasons when the final budget is done. But not the least of which will be hopefully locking in that increase in funding, which will help to bail out the capital plan from what inflation has done, because we've lost a year of the 5-year capital plan to inflation. So that'll be good news for the industry. It'll be good news for New York taxpayers. It'll be good news for drivers and employers in New York. Lots of other issues, though.
And as you said, obviously we need to wait and see what the final budget is. As we tape this show on April 15th, the budget is 2 weeks late. And their legislature are coming back in to do what looks like will be another extender to keep everything open. But we all have to continue to be vigilant, working to make sure that things that we want in the budget stay in the budget. And you just mentioned the importance of the funding that has been put into this year's budget, and also some policy that actually takes us back a step. We created our Coalition for Smart Development when the political landscape in Albany changed, when all of a sudden what we thought would be negative bills that would have a huge impact on our developing community were one-house bills. It would pass the Assembly but never go anywhere in the Senate. But when the Democratic majority took over the Senate, we realized now that there was no such thing as a one-house bill. These were two House bills that were going to be sent to the governor. One of the issues that you've taken a real strong leadership role on, and we've been fortunate to work with you and other organizations, is prevailing wage. Talk to us a little bit about, again, the concept of prevailing wage, but more importantly, again, what some of the, again, negative impacts that prevailing wage brings to projects across the state.
Yeah. So, when we talk about prevailing wage is something that is, lives in the public works space, right? And, by way of reference, our membership, we represent the whole industry. We are agnostic on the labor relations practices of our members. And so we have members that go the full spectrum from 100% union contractors to 100% open contractors, and increasingly lots of folks that operate somewhere in between, depending on the project and the market, right? That's just the reality of the construction industry at this point. We support prevailing wage as an organization. In fact, we have stood in opposition to efforts to erode prevailing wage on public works projects. But the current conversation is something very different than that, right? And it's about expanding prevailing wage to what are private work construction projects, because they're projects that are getting some sort of economic development incentive, whether it's pilot, direct funding from an economic development agency or the state or government. This is not a new issue. It's an issue that's been kicking around in Albany for a long time. We were in a lead role with a coalition of other groups that managed to hold that at bay until 2020 and the first COVID budget, when we were all locked out of the Capitol. And lo and behold, I think the last round of prints of budget bills, suddenly it appeared, and there it was. It was a slightly different version that created what's known as the Public Subsidy Wage Board, which is the entity that is appointed by principally the governor. I think there are some legislative appointments on there, if I'm not mistaken, but it's principally under the control of the executive, that when you have a question whether or not a project is covered and there's a threshold and there's exemptions, there's lots of complexities involved, the Public Subsidy Board is the arbiter of whether or not a project will be covered by prevailing wage. From our perspective, that process has worked, right? There have not been a huge number of projects that have gone to the board for determination that they're covered or not, because a lot of those projects have self-selected, right? You're over the threshold. You're able to build that into your planning for the project. The concern, though, with the proposal that's on the table now that would eliminate the Public Subsidy Board, lower thresholds for whether or not a private project is covered by prevailing wage, and potentially tinker with some of the exemptions are in there, is that you go back to, why are we giving out these incentives in the first place, right? It's not because New York has extra money and we're generous. It is because New York is a very high-cost state, no matter what it is you're trying to do, but is especially a high-cost state when it comes to construction. I think, due to things like the scaffold law and stuff like that, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find any place in America where it costs more to build than New York. So you need to incentivize projects to make them viable. And when you create another law on top of that, that will add increased costs to that project because they got an incentive, the result may very well be, and you can hear this in real time from developers, that the answer on a project may be no, thank you. We're not going to do it, or we're going to do it someplace else that's not in the state of New York.
Well, and I think that's
good for anybody.
And I think that's the biggest challenge that your organization, our organization, has when we talk to legislators, to really give them a clear understanding of what the unintended consequences and the impact will be. If we want to continue to keep cranes in the air, shovels in the ground, creating jobs, bringing in revenue, this new language that they want to put in for prevailing wage is dangerous. There are a lot of other challenges that we want to talk about. This is Advocacy and Politics Unplugged, part of the BCW Podcast Network. Our guest today is Mike Elmendorf, who's the president and CEO of the Associated General Contractors of New York State of New York. We're going to take a brief break to hear from our sponsor, Con Edison, and we'll be right back. Con Edison customers, are you looking for an efficient way to heat and cool your home? Consider geothermal heat pumps. These innovative systems turn energy from the ground around your home into cooled or heated air for climate control, providing you significant energy savings and year-round comfort. Con Edison is dedicated to sustainability and helping customers save. That's why they offer incentives for installing geothermal heat pumps. Eligible homeowners could receive rebates that significantly lower their upfront cost. By choosing geothermal, homeowners won't just save money, they'll also reduce their carbon footprint and contribute to a cleaner environment. To learn more about geothermal heat pumps and available incentives, visit coned.com/geothermal. It's a smart choice for both homes and the planet. We're back to this episode of Advocacy and Politics Unplugged, part of the BCW Podcast Network. I'm John Ravitz, the Executive Vice President and COO of the Business Council of Westchester. Our guest today is Mike Elmendorf, who is the President and CEO of the Associated General Contractors of New York State of New York. Mike, we've talked about some of the legislation in the state budget that we'd like to see not be included. But there are so many other challenges that we are seeing our developers and contractors have to go through now with what's happening in Washington. The new administration obviously has their own economic development plan, which this president has included a huge amount of tariffs for countries that our members do business with every day. What are you seeing and what are you hearing from your members about the concerns of what has really happened just over the last 10 weeks?
Well, it brings me back to that classic Genesis hit, Land of Confusion, right? I mean, and that's kind of what it is, right? I mean, so, as at a threshold level, you've got the president pursuing or not, depending on the day, an incredibly broad based tariff agenda. And, despite what people may be trying to say in explaining tariffs are a tax that will ultimately be paid by consumers or end users for the most part in the United States, unless you have other, foreign companies that decide, at least for some period of time, to absorb, at least in part or maybe in whole, some of those tariffs. But long term, that's not going to work, right? And, and so you have a wide range of construction materials that are facing or already experiencing higher costs because of tariffs. But a few other things happen, right, that make this worse. And then the biggest problem of all is the uncertainty, which we'll get to. So when you put tariffs on, say, foreign source steel, say you have a 20% tariff. Domestic producers will raise their prices by an amount almost as much, but less than that, right? So it drives up the cost of domestic products because they can, right? It also drives up demand on domestic products. So if you're looking for, if you're talking about steel, you've already got Buy American provisions in place at a lot of different levels. Now, if you're trying to avoid higher costs and tariffs, you're driving up demand for those domestic producers, which in a sense isn't a bad thing, right? You want more people buying products made in the United States, but the cost goes up, even more. So it undoubtedly drives up the cost of construction to a place where it can very well and will impact the viability or the scope of a project. This is all happening in the backdrop of what we talked about before when we talked about the DOT capital plan. We have lived through a period of unprecedented inflation, supply chain disruption due to COVID, due to global events like the war in Ukraine. We have a lot of rare earth minerals and stuff like that are essential to making things like switchgear and things. Those supply chains are still not right, given what's still going on over there. And then you're layering tariffs on top of it, because although inflation and some of these other things have eased, they never really come back to where they started, right? They don't come back down to earth. And then maybe the biggest headache of all this is what I've referred to somewhat less than affectionately as the tariff hokey pokey, right? We're in, we're out. It's on, it's off. It's impossible for contractors and owners to predict or prepare for what things might cost when it's actually time to, go out and bid a project or start building a project. And we saw this in real time just last week, right? I did an interview on tariffs and on last Tuesday, I think it was. I didn't see the story hit Wednesday. I asked when the story was going to run. The reporter said, next week. I said, well, you better call me back because, whatever we talked about isn't going to be relevant. And lo and behold, it was that afternoon the president hit the brakes on lots of his tariffs. There's a place for tariffs in trade policy, right? If you've got a bad actor, go after that bad actor. Certainly, I think most of us would agree that in a lot of ways, China's a bad actor. But when we're leveraging tariffs against our allies, our neighbors like Canada, in such a scattershot way, we're using a shotgun where really, the problem calls for a sharpshooter.
So what are you telling your members? Because obviously, as you've just listed all of these challenges now that they have to face, in terms of as they go out to look to bid, as they look to build budgets for around those projects, what's the advice that you're giving them?
The tough question, right? So just last week, Ken Simonson, who's AGC of America's chief economist, did a session for public owners across New York. So basically all the major public construction agencies were invited. Our members were not. And Ken had a frank discussion with them about what's going on, at least what was going on that morning, right? Because again, this is we're looping and spinning around here seemingly every day on this. In the private work market, there are things that a contractor and an owner and developer can do to try to put in contingencies and provide some sort of flexibility and protection so that if you do have a big spike in the cost of a material in the life of a project, there's ways to deal with it. Because in the absence of that, contractors have to include that uncertainty in their bid up front, and it drives up the cost. And maybe the tariffs don't materialize, right? Or maybe they don't materialize to the magnitude that was thought when you submitted that bid. So if you can have flexibility between the contractor and owner to be able to adjust for what happens on material costs, that helps the contractor certainly, and that's our major concern, but it also helps the owner and developer, because otherwise they're just going to see higher bids up front, because contractors that are trying to protect themselves against potentially company ending spikes in costs are going to build that into their bid. On the public works side, it's a little trickier, right? Because public owners don't necessarily have the ability to provide that type of flexibility. They have to follow various state laws depending on the level or the agency involved. And since it's public money, obviously they don't have the ability to just necessarily provide that type of flexibility. So the answer is it depends on the project and who your owner is. But it creates a very risky environment, both for our contractors and for owners, public and private, because you have, as I said, really the uncertainty at this point is almost as bad as a flawed policy, and broad-based tariffs like this are a flawed policy.
Yep. And again, it takes away what the real goal should be. And again, I keep using the analogy, we want to keep the cranes in the air and the shovels in the ground. And these type of policy shifts, again, almost on a daily basis, can cause a huge amount of upheaval. And we just have to continue to move forward in these uncertain times. I want to shift gears for a second, Mike, because again, in your intro, we talked about a coalition that you created that, again, the BCW was proud to be part of, which was the Rebuild New York Now.
Yep.
And what I find so interesting about the coalition that you created was it wasn't just the usual characters in the room. You did a broad coalition of public-private businesses. You brought in non-for-profits. You brought in religious institutions. Tell us a little bit about that journey that you took with Rebuild New York Now, and again, the important role that it's played.
Sure. Yeah. Rebuild New York Now is our organization that we're a part of that advocates for public infrastructure investment. So a lot of it's spent on roads and bridges, because that's obviously sort of the lion's share of public infrastructure investment. But we've, as you mentioned, have advocated for environmental infrastructure investment, which is critical, especially in an aging state like New York, where a lot of our stuff in the ground in particular is really old. It might be better off in a museum than moving our drinking water and sanitary water systems. But if the message is, contractors who build things think that government should spend more money building things, footage at 11, I'm not sure who's going to view that as much of a news story, right? Of course, our industry would like to see more stuff being built, because it's more opportunities for our member firms and, most importantly, the men and women who work for them, including organized labor. But when you think about it, and this is kind of what we talked about at the beginning, none of the stuff that your members do or members of chambers of commerce or other specific industry groups do work without the work and the infrastructure that our members do. And so Rebuild New York Now is basically everybody. It's labor, it's municipal organizations, mayors, villages, towns, counties have partnered with us. Specific sectors like the hospitality and tourism sector, one of the most important sectors in New York's economy. When they talk about this, they say when somebody rolls into a community in New York that is a tourist economy, and the first thing that they see are roads that look like they've been carpet bombed and bridges that they don't want to linger under, it's not a great welcome, and it maybe moves that place down the list on next year's family vacation, right? So it's really an incredibly broad-based group. And we've had a lot of success advocating for increased investment, including, what we were able to get done this year on a smaller scale, because we're looking at 1 year, the $800 million increase for DOT. Going into next year's budget cycle and after that, we're again going to be talking about another multi-year DOT capital plan. We're always talking about the MTA capital plan, which is obviously important to your constituents and to our members, because it's a critical market. But you get progress on these things by coalition building. And the Business Council of Westchester has certainly been a great partner in that effort and in lots of other efforts. The bigger the group, the broader the interest and the impact, the more ability we have to get the attention of the governor and the legislature. And our record shows that works.
No, and you're 100% right. When a legislator sees a coalition of people from Buffalo to Brooklyn, that does make a difference. I'm crazy enough, we're running out of time, but I really wanted to ask you one final question. This show is called Advocacy and Politics Unplugged. And in the introduction that I read about you, you spent your first years in public service working side by side with Governor Pataki, working with the legislature. You then moved on to NFIB and now into your current role as the Associated General Contractors of New York State, New York. What are some of the lessons that you've learned when you were in government that you then had to transfer over to when you were on the other side, so to speak, to advocate on behalf of your members?
Yeah, well, I mean, my time in the governor's office was just an incredible opportunity. I still pinch myself sometimes that it happened. I was 21 years old when I started working there, which I think is about when I first met you, John.
Yep.
Because as your listeners may know, I had a lot of great colleagues there, but none better than one Barry Ravitz, who was my counterpart in the governor's New York City office. Your wife, was a great colleague and a dear friend, and still is. Certainly it gave me an understanding of government, at the highest levels. I mean, they used to talk about three men in the room when they were doing the budget. I was the fourth man in and out of that room from time to time. I sat right next to the governor and got to see everything that was going on, got to know the legislative leaders. It's been a long time. A lot of those folks are no longer in Albany. The legislature's had a lot of turnover. But, I think it gave me a real understanding of how things work on the inside. Probably the best thing I learned from that, having worked up close with Governor Pataki, who's a great leader and a great friend to this day, was how to treat people. You know him well, John, and, again, Barry, having worked for him, you've heard the same. He treated me the same as he treated the Senate Majority Leader, as he treated the OGS guy who'd come in at the end of the day to tidy up the office or change out the water jug. No ego, no sense of entitlement, just decency and a real drive for service and making things better. And of all the things I learned in my time there, and there were lots of them, that's probably the greatest one. And that's a lesson that I got to tell you, I try to instill in my kids now. He was that great of a mentor and role model.
Well, we need more people like that in government on all levels about that. And now when you go back and sit down with legislators to talk about whether it's prevailing wage, whether it's about the state DOT capital plan or the MTA capital plan, what are some of the lessons that you've learned that you think have helped you begin to build those type of relationships?
Well, I think it's an appreciation that, I know, having been there and done it, that they are balancing competing interests and arguments and constituents and politics, right, all at once. I'll have this conversation now sometimes with our board. There's a legislator that we work with and develop a relationship with on a particular issue, and they're our champion on this. And then our members will say, well, wait a minute, they're for this bill that we hate, and they voted for this, and they voted for that. How can you say that they're our friend? Well, as you pointed out, Albany's changed, right? There may be folks in Albany that are friends to us and you on every single issue, but they're not the folks in the majority, right? And unless there's something coming down the pike that I'm not aware of, I don't know that anytime soon that they're going to be. So, the definition of who your friends are has changed. And we've done very well, and you've done very well as well, in an environment where, you got to pick your friends on particular issues and get done what you can. And getting done what you can get done these days is often not killing a bad idea, but turning a bad idea into an idea we can live with, right? When you can't stop something. So it's about resetting your expectations, but it starts with an appreciation that whether it's the governor or members of the legislature, they're balancing a lot of competing interests. And you've got to try to find the angle to get your issue or your perspective into that conversation so that it's reflected in whatever comes out at the end of that decision-making process.
It's not easy, but it makes it a little easier when you have someone with the lifetime experience of Mike Elmendorf, who is the president and CEO of the Associated General Contractors of New York State of New York. Mike, thanks for joining us today. I'm sure I'll see you in the halls of Albany between now and the end of session. But again, thank you for the commitment that you've made to not only New York State, but to the employers of the New York State as well.
And thank you, John. I look forward to that and appreciate your longstanding friendship and partnership and look forward to continuing it.
Thanks. We want to thank our sponsor, Con Edison, for being the sponsor for Advocacy and Politics Unplugged. This is John Ravitz, the Executive Vice President and CEO of the Business Council of Westchester, and we hope you'll tune in again to our next episode.
Be sure to check out the BCW Podcast Network's expansive lineup of shows: Leadership Unleashed, What's Trending, Advocacy and Politics Unplugged, The Member Spotlight, and Nonprofit Voices of Impact. The Business Council of Westchester is the county's largest business membership organization focusing on economic development and advocacy. With over 1,100 members, it is our mission to work for the profitability of our members and the prosperity of the Westchester community. To learn more, go to thebcw.org.